Picture this. It's the summer of 1969, a warm June night in New York City. Inside a dimly lit bar in Greenwich Village, people gather, laughing, dancing, simply trying to exist in a world that refuses to accept them. Then, the peace is shattered. A police raid, like so many that had come before, but this time, something is different. The Stonewall Uprising wasn't the first or last act of resistance from the LGBTQ+ community, but it became a spark that ignited a movement. And more than half a century later, that fight is far from over. Because today, in 2025, the echoes of that night still ring out. Across the United States, new laws seek to silence and erase members of the LGBTQ+ community. The tactics may have changed, but the struggle remains. So what happened on those sweltering nights in 1969 that turned a routine raid into a rebellion? And why does it still matter now? Hi, I'm your host, Katie, and welcome to Learning Out Loud, where history isn't just about the past, it's the key to understanding today. We'll be continuing our American Rebellion series this week by talking about the Stonewall Uprising. And I actually just got back from visiting New York City, and I was able to visit the Stonewall Inn and the National Monument. And I feel very lucky to have gotten to see it because with the current administration, who knows what will even become of monuments honoring the LGBTQ+ community. And if you want to say I'm exaggerating, the administration has already removed the T+ from their websites, and that includes the Stonewall Monuments website because it's part of the NPS, the National Park Services, like we mentioned in the last few episodes. And it's really sad because trans women actually played a major role in this, not only this uprising, but in a lot of the gay rights movements. Before we get into it, like I said, I'm going to try to start recommending some movies and documentaries and other sources in case you're not super into reading nonfiction or the more academic things. So we've got a movie called Stonewall, made in 1995. I did not watch this one yet, but I can update you on it. There's mixed reviews on it. I did watch the PBS American Experience documentary called Stonewall Uprising, and that one was really good. It talks to a lot of people who were there at the time, so it's always good to hear first-person accounts. Then there's also a documentary on Netflix that I've started, but at the time of recording, I have not yet finished. That is called The Death and Life of Marsha P Johnson. We'll be talking about her later. And then there's another documentary on Amazon Prime called Before Stonewall and After Stonewall. And then there's also a tribute on YouTube called Sylvia Rivera, A Tribute. And then if you're looking for podcasts besides this beautiful episode, one of my favorite podcasts called Ladies and Tangents did an episode on June 28th, 2022, and it's called Horny for Nonconformity, the Stonewall Uprising. And then there's also a podcast episode from You're Wrong About that aired originally on June 27th, 2019, and that's titled The Stonewall Uprising. And then My Favorite Murder also did an episode about it from June 4th, 2020 called It's Jenga. And I think they number their episodes as well. That was episode 225. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let's go back to where it all began. And first, we got to start with some background. So I feel like gay rights movement, just gay rights in general, gay rights history is not really talked about. And so therefore, I feel like this background is even more important because although this didn't happen that long ago, my parents were like preteens. So I always like to put it in that kind of perspective because people like to pretend that, like racism, homophobism, and all that stuff doesn't exist anymore because that was such a long time ago. But it's really not. So I like to put it in terms of like how old my parents were, because that's just one generation from myself. Anyways, I think it's easy to forget not even forget, because if we're not taught it, then how can we know? But even though it's a scary time for members of the LGBTQ plus community, there has been major strides for gay rights. And so I feel like it's kind of easy to overlook the amount of progress that has been made so far and what life was like for people of the LGBTQ plus community. So I think that's why it's important that we talk about what life was like in the 1960s. As you may know just from general American history, the 1960s were a pretty eventful time, to put it mildly. Richard Nixon had just taken office in January of 1969, and this kind of starts off the more modern conservative track, because after that you've got Reagan. And this turn to conservatism could also be seen as a response to a lot of the things that were going on in the 60s. There was a lot of protesting, a lot of rebellions. You had the hippie movement, counterculture protesting. You have civil rights movement. You have women's liberation. The protests for or against the Vietnam War. So, and then so we have all that going on. And then the 60s saw a lot of assassinations of political leaders. JFK was assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated the year before the Stonewall Uprising in 1968. And Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated also in 1968. So this is a very volatile, scary time in the 1960s, but it's also a time where people of all groups are standing up for themselves and demanding equality, equal rights, peace, love, and all that good stuff. Just a little bit more about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This, as a reminder, prohibited discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, and national origin. This legally ended the era of Jim Crow laws and segregation. And I mean legally because it's not like, you sign that law into place and then just racism goes away. Even though that's kind of how we tell our history, it's not the case. And that's why you see the civil rights movement still going on. Black people had to fight for this, not only for this act to be passed, but to actually be enforced. But we can talk about that in another episode. But I wanted to kind of bring this up a little bit more specifically because this act was expanded to protect transgender people from employment discrimination in a 2020 Supreme Court case called Bostock versus Clayton County. And this found that federal law prohibits workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So you can kind of see how long members of the LGBTQ plus community have been fighting for equal rights, because that was only 5 years ago. And again, this is important to talk about because with Donald Trump being back in the White House, he has already signed executive orders trying to erase trans people from government websites, the military, and just in general. And like I said, it has been erased from the Stonewall National Monument website. And we'll talk about this a little bit later at the end, but they're actually using the Civil Rights Act to ban trans people. But anyways, back to the 60s. During this time, homosexual relations and relationships were illegal and could be punishable by 1 to 20 years imprisonment. And that's specifically from Georgia's sodomy laws. Gay people could be sent to psychiatric facilities where they would receive electroshock therapy as a way to, quote, cure them. And I'll just give you a second to guess when the last of these laws were repealed. Did you guess 2003? If you did, you were right. And that was because of the Supreme Court case Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down sodomy laws, making same-sex sexual activity legal nationwide. And actually, shout out to Illinois for being the first state to decriminalize homosexuality in 1961. During this time, not only was homosexuality illegal, it was also listed as a mental disorder in the 1968 first publication of the DSM, which was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And that was the case until 1987, when it was completely removed. So not only was it illegal and considered a mental disorder, gay people and other members of the LGBTQ plus community were heavily discriminated against, and the targets of brutal violence that included being strangled, shot, thrown in the river, blackmailed, and barred from jobs. Again, this is going to be something that we kind of talk about to wrap up this episode, but the way that a lot of U.S. history is told for minority groups is you get like one story or two, and that's it. And it's kind of like, see, we had this problem, but then this happened, and now everything's fine. And so although the Stonewall Uprising is very important, within the context of U.S. history, it's often the only story told about the gay rights movement, and making it seem like it was the only one. But I just wanted to highlight that that's not the case. There was people working very hard for gay rights before the Stonewall Uprising and afterwards. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that happened before Stonewall Uprising, because again, the Stonewall Uprising was not something that just happened out of the blue one day. People had been organizing, fighting for their rights like before this. And that was not just a spur of the moment, spontaneous act. The first documented U.S. gay rights organization was called the Society for Human Rights and was founded by Henry Gerber, a German immigrant, in 1924. They were able to publish several issues of their newsletter, Friendship and Freedom, before being disbanded by the police a year later. And this was also the first U.S. gay interest newsletter. The first U.S. lesbian rights organization was called the Daughters of Bilitis and was formed in San Francisco in 1955. And then in 1966, just a few years before Stonewall, a group called the Mattachine Society, which was a gay rights organization, organized a sit-in where members would openly declare their sexuality in bars, daring the staff to turn them away, and then they would sue any establishments that did. The Commission on Human Rights eventually ruled that gay individuals had the right to be served in bars, and police raids were temporarily reduced. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the time period and what it was like to be gay in the 1960s, let's talk about the Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in New York City, and it was ran by a group you might not necessarily associate with gay rights: the Mafia. Yes, that's right. The Mafia owned and operated most, if not all, of the gay bars in New York City at the time. And while it would be nice to think that they did this out of the kindness of their hearts, it was mostly just pure business. It was an untapped market, you know? Regardless, it did give gay people the opportunity to hang out and at least a little bit of safety. Specifically, the Stonewall was ran by the Genovese family and by a guy named Fat Tony, and they would bribe the NYPD about $1,200 a month, 1960s money, to keep the police away from the bar. And they got around the liquor laws by deeming the Stonewall what they called a bottle club or a private club, which from what I understand makes it sound like it's a BYOB club. So they didn't need a liquor license because everyone brought their own. And then because it was a private club, that made it harder for the police to raid, even without any bribery. So the reason why they could also be raided was that bars that served alcohol to gay people were considered, quote, disorderly houses by the state liquor license authority, and they would refuse to give liquor licenses. And then if you were operating without a liquor license, the police could raid you. And a couple things to point out that the mafia was simply running these gay bars to make money. They would cut corners on safety and hygiene. They did not have running water in the Stonewall. So bartenders would use like buckets of water that would get dirtier over the course of the night to wash the glasses in. And a gay rights group actually blamed the Stonewall for a 1969 outbreak of hepatitis. It also didn't have any emergency exits, and the only way in and out was through the narrow front door entrance, and that will be important later. And allegedly, I don't want any beef with the mafia, the alcohol served was either stolen or bootlegged and then watered down and sold at really high prices. And also allegedly, they would extort and blackmail wealthy patrons who were not open about their sexuality. So yeah, not great. And I feel like this is also a kind of like a position of the mafia of like, take it or leave it. Like, you can't do this anywhere else, so, you know, you can't complain sort of thing, which is messed up. Despite paying off the police, these mafia-ran gay bars did still get raided. And owners would be prepared for this by storing most of their alcohol in hidden wall panels or cars outside because the police would confiscate it. And if their bar was shut down, what they would usually do is just literally take all their supplies, move to a new space somewhere down the block, and open up a new bar the next day. And this is all very reminiscent of like prohibition speakeasies back in the 1920s. But let's not forget, this is the late 1960s. So this was kind of just like a normal part of the gay bar scene. The police would raid the gay bars early in the night when they weren't very crowded and to not cause a scene. They'd hand out a few tickets to the bar owners and then be on their way. And this was a very established practice. Except for the night of the Stonewall Uprising. It went much different. The NYPD had a new moral division that was supposed to clean up the city, and they claimed that they were mostly targeting the mafia, but let's be real. They were very clearly targeting the LGBTQ plus community. This night, the police waited until very late into the night, and I mean, technically it was the early hours of the following day, so the place was packed. People had been drinking all night. And instead of just ticketing the bar, they blocked the entrance. Remember, this is the only way in or out. And they started forcing people outside one by one, but not before forcing everyone to show them their IDs. And then they had a paddy wagon pull up, which, if you don't know what that is just a big like van thing where they would, you could put a lot of arrested people in and then drive them off to jail. They pull up and they start arresting the queens. And this is what a lot of trans women would refer to themselves at the time, because there was another weird law at the time where you had to be wearing 3 items of gender appropriate clothing. And if you weren't, you could be arrested. At first, the patrons are making, light of it and refusing to let the police intimidate them or ruin their night. As they exit the bars, they're kind of pretending it's a runway. They're sashaying down the sidewalk, saying funny little one-liners, blowing kisses to the cops, that sort of thing. All the commotion, though, kind of starts to draw a crowd. This is a gay neighborhood, essentially. And so everyone knows, hey, this is not how things usually happen, what's going on. Because the police aren't sticking to the usual plan, the bar patrons and the neighbors are sticking around to make sure that their friends are okay. And because they also think that once the police are gone, they can just go back inside and continue their night, which is usually what happens after a raid. But then the police are dragging out a person who is only known to this day as the, quote, butch lesbian. She was resisting, wiggling about, trying to break free from the cops and giving them a really hard time trying to get her into the paddy wagon. And in the PBS doc, other people that were there saw her resisting, and they describe it kind of like this light bulb moment of like, oh, we can resist, we can fight back. I didn't know that was an option. And the police didn't expect any resistance because, most of the patrons were gay men, and the stereotypes of gay men being, that they're weak, subordinate, effeminate, etc., the stereotype. And then again, from the PBS doc, someone who participated in the uprising said that pretty much every other and we kind of talked about this in the intro of like what was going on in the 60s. He was saying like pretty much every other minority group had rebelled before the Stonewall Uprising, and everyone was kind of rebelling and protesting for better treatment, but no one really ever expected gay people to do that. And as we're learning through this series, rebelling is an American tradition and frankly one of the few ways to affect change. So why wouldn't gay people rebel? Why would you expect them just to accept the discrimination and violence perpetuated against them? After seeing the butch lesbian kind of resisting the cops, the patrons and those hanging around on the street start accosting the cops. They're calling them names, resisting arrest, and then they start throwing pennies at them, because it's coppers. They're the coppers. The crowd starts to get more emboldened, and the police realize that they are severely outnumbered because they were not expecting any resistance. So they actually barricade themselves within the Stonewall Inn. People go and get lighters from the corner store and try lighting the Stonewall on fire. A group of men are able to get a parking meter free from the sidewalk, and they start using it as a battering ram to try to get into the Stonewall. Police try calling for backup, but their radios keep getting interference. And from what I infer from the documentary, it sounded like that was being done on purpose. But one of the female cops was able to crawl out through the bathroom window, and it kind of also made it seem like most of the other cops were able to follow her through. But eventually, police backup arrive. But because the streets are so narrow and the way the Stonewall is located, and Flip's hair, I was just there, so I can attest to this. There's kind of like a weird convergence of streets that make like a little triangle, and then on that triangle there's just like one little triangle shaped building, and then the block of the Stonewall Inn is really small, so you've got the 4 streets around it that are pretty close, and then you've got a triangle of streets like right next to it. And so what was happening as more police were coming to the scene, the crowd, which was so big, they would start off by being chased by the police, but then they could double back across these streets and end up coming behind the police that were then chasing them, kind of like a Tom and Jerry cartoon scenario. And then because there was such a large crowd, they could kind of strategically come back upon the police from the back and still keep a group of people in the front and then box in the police. And I really identify with this. They were, using humor almost as a form of protest. And they, in front of the police officers, form like a kick line, like the Rockettes, and they just start high kicking right in front of the police. And I just really appreciate the humor that these protesters had throughout the night. I can't imagine how terrifying this must have actually been to face down the NYPD. But I love that they didn't show that fear, and instead they used humor and cleverness to fight back. But I mean, there was violence. Let's not get that wrong. They threw pennies. They tried to ram through the inn. But that being said, eventually enough police showed up to start being a threat. And as soon as they got the upper hand, they began violently beating the protesters back. People who were there said it seemed like the police were purposefully aiming for protesters' heads with their nightsticks, and soon bloodied bodies were strewn all over the streets. And then within a few hours after that, the protesters dispersed, but they were not deterred. They printed out thousands of leaflets, which someone on the documentary said is the equivalent of a social media post today, that they passed out the next day talking about what happened and just general discrimination and harassment gay people have been suffering under, and what the protests would be about, and that they would be continuing outside of the Stonewall Inn that night. And the protests ended up lasting for 5 more days. But sadly, I would say not very much came from these protests in terms of legislation or improvement of gay people's lives, really. But that didn't stop them. And a year later, gay rights activists wanted to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. So they decided that they were going to march from Stonewall to Central Park, where they would have a rally and, kind of a party as openly gay people. Again, this was a time where you could have your entire life ruined if society found out you were gay. There were no protections. Like we said, gay people could be fired from their jobs. They would be ostracized from society. That's the best case scenario. They oftentimes faced physical violence. So it was a very brave thing for these people to do. And thousands of people showed up for the march. And this actually kicks off the tradition that we now know as Gay Pride that happens in June. And like I said, although not much legal or societal changes came directly from the Stonewall Uprising, it did spark a new wave of political activism within the gay community. Previous gay rights groups just wanted to be accepted into the status quo of American life. This gave way to more radical groups like the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance. And this is from Britannica, quote, "In addition to launching numerous public demonstrations to protest the lack of civil rights for gay individuals, these organizations often resorted to such tactics as public confrontations with political officials and the disruption of public meetings to challenge and to change the mores of the times. Acceptance and respect from the establishment were no longer being humbly requested, but angrily and righteously demanded. The broad-based radical activism of many gay men and lesbians in the 1970s eventually set into motion a new, non-discriminatory trend in government policies and helped educate society regarding this significant minority," end quote. And so, that kind of goes to the notion of never giving up. Just because the first time you speak up, nothing happens, doesn't mean you should just be quiet and go away. Like, oh, I'm sorry about that. No, you need to keep fighting and, speaking your mind, speaking up for yourself. And, in the 70s, it eventually did lead to, like I said, non-discriminatory practices in the government. So let that be a reminder to us all. Don't give up on yourself. But that being said, LGBTQ plus people had, and let's be real, still have to fight for decades to be treated equally. About a decade later, in the 1980s, the gay community would be ravaged by the AIDS epidemic, and the lack of response from the government showed just how far we had to go as a nation to be more inclusive and accepting. And as we discussed in the intro, it wasn't until 2003 that same-sex sexual activity was made legal in all 50 states, and it wasn't until 2015 that same-sex marriage became legal in all 50 states. But before we kind of move on into the aftermath, I wanted to briefly mention some of the leaders and important figures of the Stonewall Uprising. First, we have Marsha P Johnson. She was a Black transgender woman. She's often credited with launching the uprising. She and her friend and co-leader, Sylvia Rivera, came upon the Stonewall right as things were starting to shift in tone. Marsha was only 23 years old at the time, and transgender people were at the front lines of this uprising because they were the most heavily discriminated against. And honestly, they felt like they had nothing to lose. Marsha said the P in her name stood for Pay It No Mind, and this became her motto. She was also a gay liberation activist, a self-identified drag queen, and sex worker. She advocated for the homeless LGBTQ plus youth, those affected by HIV and AIDS, and for gay and trans rights throughout the 60s and all the way through to the 80s. And like I said, there's a Netflix documentary about her called The Death and Life of Marsha P Johnson. And that kind of revolves around the fact that she was sadly found deceased in the river in 1992. And the police wrote it off as a suicide. But many people who know her do not believe that is the case. And if you want to learn more about that, you should check out the Netflix documentary. And then there is Sylvia Rivera, as I mentioned. She was with Marsha P Johnson on the front lines of the Stonewall Uprising. She was a Latina transgender woman and ran away from a horrible home situation at the age of 11 to New York City, but then became a victim of sexual exploitation. She met Marsha in 1963, and she said that it changed her life. She often referred to Marsha as being like a mother to her. And she was only 17 at the time of the Stonewall Uprising. And despite her young age, she said later on that it was not her first protest and that she had previously been active in the Black Liberation Movement and the Peace Movement. And after leading the protests at Stonewall, she continued to fight for trans people and others who were excluded from the larger gay rights movement. Sylvia and Marsha created the Street Transvestite, which was a common term at the time, Action Revolutionaries, or otherwise known as STAR, in 1971, which was a space to organize and discuss issues facing the trans community and to also house anyone who needed it. Although it didn't last long, it was a very important space for trans folks at the time. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but another really sad issue that affected the gay community and the trans community was the rate of homelessness. For people that were brave enough to come out to their family members, a lot of times they would actually be kicked out of their home. There were a lot of LGBTQ plus youth who were homeless, and that was a really big issue. And so this Star House was really important for them because it gave them a place that they could live. Sylvia struggled with the trauma of her past and how to deal with it, and struggled with substance abuse and attempted suicide. Marsha had her back, though, and she took her to the hospital and helped her get healthy again. Sylvia stepped away from activism and New York City for a bit during this time, but she later came back after Marsha's death and picked up where she left off. Sylvia started another similar space called the Transy House in 1997, and she reconciled with the gay rights movement, which was starting to become more inclusive. And she died in 2002 from liver cancer. However, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project continues her legacy, working to guarantee, quote, that all people are free to self-determine their gender identity and expression, regardless of income or race, and without facing harassment, discrimination, or violence, end quote. The intersection of Christopher and Hudson Streets in Greenwich Village, 2 blocks away from the Stonewall Inn, was renamed Sylvia Rivera Way. And another leader of the uprising was a Black trans woman named Miss Major, also Miss Major Griffin Gracie. After Stonewall, she became a powerful voice for trans and intersex rights, including working as the executive director of the Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project. She is still alive, and she currently runs the House of GGTILIFI, a retreat center for trans and gender nonconforming leaders from the South. She is also an executive producer for the series called Trans in Trumpland, and here's a blurb on the show. Trans in Trumpland is a 4-episode docuseries about the impact of the Trump administration on the transgender community. Filmed in states that voted for Trump, the series sheds light on the transgender Americans most impacted by the anti-trans policies. Trans in Trumpland was Emmy shortlisted, nominated for a GLAAD Award, and received critical acclaim, end quote. She has also written a book that she co-authored with Toshio Maronek called Miss Major Speaks, which is about her life's activism. Let's have a little discussion and wrap things up. In the You're Wrong About podcast episode, one of the hosts, Michael Hobbs, brings up several important notes that I kind of wanted to talk about as well. And one of the points is that the gay rights movement and gay people at the time were not perfect, either as a movement or as a people. There was still a lot of racism, discrimination against trans people, and even classism. Leaders of the gay rights movement argued that they wanted to focus on gay rights and didn't want to bring in other factors like race or, other sort of non-conforming gender or sexual identities. Gay bars at the time would often turn away people of color and or trans people. And I don't bring this up to discredit the Stonewall Uprising. It was a very important event and deserves to be discussed and known, but I felt that it was also important to acknowledge the shortcomings of the movement and point out how important intersectionality is. You know the saying, no one is free until we are all free. And that's why it is important to stand up for marginalized groups, even if you have no direct connection to them. And the other point that Michael Hobbs brings up is the idea of how we talk about U.S. history and whose story gets told, how it's told, and who tells it. And I kind of briefly touched on this earlier, and this is where we'll kind of go into a little bit more. I think it's an important conversation in general to have, and he talks about why it's important for this story in particular. He talks about how there's this kind of theme in U.S. history when talking about different minority groups, and that they basically get one or two stories, and they're nice little stories all wrapped up perfectly in a little bow, and they kind of end with and that's how we fix the problem. For example, the Stonewall Uprising is like the one story about the gay rights movement, and I would say it's probably not universally known or as well known. People know about gay pride, but I would say they probably don't know the history behind it or where it comes from. But regardless, so we have the Stonewall Uprising. That is the story about the gay rights movement. And then we kind of say gay people had enough of the violence and discrimination. And so they took a stand and they fought for their rights to be treated equally. And it worked. And now there's no more homophobia or discrimination against any LGBTQ plus people. And we celebrate gay rights with a pride parade every year. That's kind of how it sounds, right? And that's the only story we ever hear. We don't hear any of the nuances or about any other gay rights movements or any other stories that take place after it about discrimination. And if you bring it up, people will point to the Stonewall Uprising and be like, no, there's no discrimination against gay people anymore. We fixed that back in the 60s. It's kind of the same thing that like when people bring up Barack Obama being elected president as proof that racism no longer exists. And I feel like another common thing is like, here's your holiday or month. Now shut up about being discriminated against. And I think this point is very true and it's important to recognize. I think this is a very true statement, and I think it's important to not only recognize, but then to go and find these other stories and share them with each other. And that's honestly one of the goals of this podcast, is to kind of bring awareness to stories that we might not have been told in our history class. Our history is so much more nuanced and frankly more interesting than just one story. For a country so diverse as the U.S., no one group should be defined, or let's be honest, dismissed with just one story. And as of this recording, Cory Booker just ended his record-breaking 25-hour and 4-minute speech on the floor of the Senate. And I just wanted to quote something he said about why American history is so important, and I really, really loved it. And this quote is kind of referring to this nicely neat package stories we tell ourselves of, marginalized groups and how they get one story and everything's all wrapped up nicely, and now those people are treated nice. And it's wrong if you bring up anything else. And if you try to bring up, anything that's darker in terms of a historical story, then you're trying to make everyone feel guilty and, all these negative things. And it's really not the case. And I think that Cory Booker really articulated this in a very beautiful way. And here's the quote. American history, if nothing else, is a perpetual testimony to the achievement of the impossible things against impossible odds. I don't want a Disney-ification of American history. I don't want a whitewashed version of history. I don't want a homogenized history. Tell me the wretched truth about America, because that speaks to our greatness. And I mean, damn, that was good. And it's true. I am probably a little biased because I am a history nerd, but I think the more you learn about your country's history, the good, the bad, the ugly, the more appreciation you have for it. And I think the more able you are to help to make it better. How can you make things better if you don't know what the problems are? You can't pretend that your country is both perfect and that it needs to be better. You know what I mean? Anyway, that quote really got me, and I've been thinking about it since. Let's get back to our story. The gay rights movement did not begin or end with Stonewall Uprising, and while it's important to acknowledge the significance of it, I think it's also as important to continue the conversations and share as many stories as possible. And that's why I'm here. Wink. But to wrap up this episode, I wanted to end with kind of some aftermath, where are they now, what's happened, and connect it back into what's happening now. The Stonewall Inn closed down within a few months of the uprising, but in 1999, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. And in 2016, President Obama designated the site and the surrounding area as a national monument. In 2019, shortly before the 50th anniversary of the uprising, the then New York City Police Commissioner James P. O'Neill issued an apology on behalf of the police department saying, quote, "The actions taken by the NYPD were wrong, plain and simple," end quote. Which, I guess is something. The Stonewall Inn reopened in the 90s under new management, so not the mob, and is currently still a popular gay bar. And going back to what I mentioned at the top of the show about the current administration's attempt to erase trans people from our history and our society. This past Monday, at the time of recording, was the Transgender Day of Visibility. So I just wanted to highlight that and connect the Stonewall Uprising to what's currently going on today in the U.S. The government has erased the TQIA+ from all its websites, like I mentioned, and that includes the Stonewall Monument page. It simply has LGB, even though the main leaders of the uprising were trans women, and trans women of color to be specific. Not only that, the administration is also trying to rid the military and women's sports of trans people and demonizing trans people, but only singling out trans women under the guise of, quote, protecting women. And the executive order from Trump is titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. They are trying to portray trans women specifically as just heterosexual cis men dressed up in a disguise for the sole purpose of assaulting women in female bathrooms. But if we look at the statistics, I think heterosexual cis men are having a perfectly easy time assaulting women, just in general. They don't need to put a dress on. And they also claim that they want to protect women from being hurt or unfairly beaten in sports. That's kind of the big thing right now in current events. But I would just like to point out that just trans people in general make up roughly about a 0.95% of the U.S. adult population. And again, that's not even a full percentage point. So let's stop with our faux outrage, go help the economy or something. And of that 0.095%, you want to take a guess at how many are NCAA college athletes? According to the NCAA president Charlie Baker's testimony, there are fewer than 10 trans athletes out of a total of 500,000 college athletes. And doing the math real quick, that is a 0.002% of college athletes. There's so much more that we could dive into here, and I'd honestly love to do an episode about just kind of these numbers and scare tactics that people are throwing about, because it's all misinformation and fueled by hatred. And I would like to speak some truth and humanity and kindness back into the subject. But before we end this section, I wanted to read a paragraph from an article titled Executive Orders and the Erasure of Trans People, written by Christopher Wright Durocher, VP of Policy and Program for the American Constitution Society. So these are people that study the American Constitution. Quote, furthermore, the executive order, the one I mentioned, directed the Attorney General to, quote, issue guidance to ensure the freedom to express the binary nature of sex and the right to single-sex spaces in workplaces and federally funded entities covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, end quote. But then still within the quote of Christopher, as the context of the executive order makes clear, the freedom to express the binary nature of sex includes permission to discriminate against and exclude trans people. The irony, or perhaps gall, of invoking the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to justify discrimination against trans people would be laughable if it were not so dangerous. Like the Office of Management and Budget memo purporting to freeze all financial assistance programs in order to root out so-called woke gender ideology, among other things, the lawlessness of the executive order is troubling. This is especially true considering that a conservative-dominated Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Justice Gorsuch and joined by Chief Justice Roberts, explicitly found that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects trans people from discrimination in the workplace, end quote. Hello? Like, what the fuck? So that's what I was talking about, and that's why I wanted to explain the civil rights a little bit up front, because in this discussion to kind of tie the past and present, why history is so important, is that this administration is using the Civil Rights Act, which was an act to stop discrimination for a multitude of reasons. They're now using it to discriminate against trans people. It makes me so frustrated. And this is why it's so important to learn your history. This is wrong, just from a constitutional perspective, even if you're transphobic. Anyways, I just wanted to emphasize that while it is about trans people today, the explanations and methods with which they're going about to erase and discriminate trans people will be the same ways in the future that they use to discriminate against me, to discriminate against you, to discriminate against your friends. Everyone should be alarmed at how the current administration is so blatantly going against our Constitution and due process. It might not affect you today, but believe me, it will come for us all eventually. But switching gears a little, still related though, I wanted to end with this: the importance of words. So what is the importance of a name, right? The Stonewall Uprising was originally called the Stonewall Riots. And I think that words are very important, especially when it comes to history, and especially when it comes to who is writing that history and when it was written. We need to pay attention to those things. A riot is defined as a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. And an uprising is defined as an act of opposition by many people, sometimes using violence, against those who are in power. And those are definitions I took from the interwebs. Historian Elizabeth Hinton, when speaking about the riot report that was conducted by the U.S. government in 1967, and that was kind of specifically towards the riots seen by Black people, and again, quote, riots. But I think it can also be applied to this situation because the LGBTQ plus community is also a minority group that was and is heavily discriminated against. She said, quote, "The word riot was nothing less than a racist trope applied to events that can only be properly understood as rebellions. Explosions of collective resistance to an unequal and violent order," end quote. By using riot to describe what happened at the Stonewall Inn is to classify the people rebelling as reckless and violent for seemingly no reason and or out of the blue. It erases all of the discrimination, violence, harassment, murder that these people had faced up until this point by both law enforcement and their fellow citizens. And it also justifies the violence that was used against the protesters. And as we wrap up this American Rebellion series, I just wanted to make a note of this and to remind us all to always view historical documents or tellings with a critical lens and to be aware of the language being used to describe the people in the story, especially if they are a marginalized group. In conclusion, the Stonewall Uprising wasn't the beginning of the fight for the LGBTQ plus community, and it certainly wasn't the end. But it was a turning point, a moment when people who had been told to shrink themselves, to hide, to accept injustice and violence, finally said, enough. That resistance, that refusal to disappear, sent ripples through history. It gave rise to a movement that has brought real change, real progress. The same forces that tried to silence and control the LGBTQ plus community in 1969 still exist today, in different forms, wearing different masks. New laws, new restrictions, new attempts to erase identities and deny rights. And yet, if we listen closely, we can still hear the voices of those who stood at Stonewall. Their defiance, their courage, their hope. It's all still here, passed down to us through their stories. They didn't know what the future would hold. They didn't know if they would win, but they stood their ground anyway. And now, it's our turn. We honor them not just by remembering, but by continuing the fight for justice, for dignity, and for the right to simply be. Because history isn't just something we remember. It's something we carry with us. Yesterday's stories are today's lessons, and what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for next week for our series finale.